Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 6 of the Argument Clinic. My name is Martin Sigalo, and that's Lawrence Zhao. How are you doing, Lawrence?
Not too bad. How about yourself?
Not too bad. I am doing splendid. I'm also doing splendidly. Things are great. I'm excited. I think we both are excited to bring you this episode of the podcast on the 2AR. That's our topic for this week. Spoiler alert. But if you're just joining us for the first time, welcome to the Argument Clinic. We are a debate podcast for everyone, whether you're a novice, whether you're a seasoned varsity competitor, whether you are a full-time professional clown, whether you, but you also do LD on the side, whether you're an LD coach, whether you're just someone that likes listening to the soothing silence between when I talk and when Lawrence talk. This is the podcast for you. We are, one of the more wholesome debate podcasts. We send very uplifting messages like things not to do in cross-examination, and if you listen to our last episodes, an about 20-minute long clip of us trying to remember one thing not to do in cross-ex and just sitting there unable to figure it out. So if you're one of the lucky 100 or so listeners of the last episode of the podcast, well, this one goes out to Lawrence's editing skills.
My bad.
Just kidding. We intended it to be there all the time. Yeah. So, Lawrence, what have you done the last 2 weeks? Where in the world was Lawrence Zhao?
Surprisingly, I don't think I was at a debate tournament. I was wait, yes, I was. I was at TFA State. I forgot about that. That was so long ago. I was at TFA State, where for the first time I had an AF side bias at a tournament. I voted AF 6 out of 8 times
Nice.
at a tournament. Whereas usually my neg side bias is something like I vote AF only 30% of the time. So that was a first for me.
Everyone, if you're still debating the March-April topic, like if that's a thing that you're going to do, just make that argument. Just be like, side bias in favor of the affirmative because that's how Lawrence Zhao votes every time. So, for example,
the AF side bias
TFA.
is so overwhelming. It's so overwhelming.
That's what you should say. You should just be like, Lawrence Zhao says that there's presumption or that Lawrence is a bad judge, one of those two things. So,
both of those things.
both of those things. AF side bias, also he's bad. Wow, that's good. So this past weekend, I actually went to the Woodward tournament. We also had NSDA quals the weekend before. We qualified one person to NSDAs, despite having 3 of the top 4 people, but because of the way that qualifications worked and the double elimination stuff, we couldn't quite get both spots, but we had 1 spot, which was good. And then I went to Woodward, one of my totally favorite tournaments of the entire year. Have you ever been to Woodward, Lawrence?
I have not. Neither as a competitor or a judge.
You should totally go. Woodward, for those of you that don't know, is the first and second year national tournament. It's not like super official, but it basically is like people from really big debate schools all around the country, like Harvard Westlake and Greenhill, Lake Holland Preparatory School, where I coached this year. West Des Moines Valley went. There are a lot of good schools. And one of my students made the finals of novice, which was the first time that Lake Highland has ever done that, to my knowledge. And we also had a quarterfinalist in JV. So special shout out to Parnika Agrawal and Megan Srinivasa. Lawrence, what do you have to say about my splendid debaters?
I'm sure they're good, even though you're their coach.
Wow, that's true. They do have just a natural barrier to overcome. One more thing, before we jump into all of the various promotional stuff, we did get an email chastising us for the use of the phrase "silly goose" in the last podcast. They presented a lot of compelling counter examples of ways of gooses feeling other emotions, but we sent them a very we sent them a response email that was disheartening and devastating. So hopefully that will cause the goose the goose sympathizer to get off our tail. But every email that we've gotten so far has been has been good. We've gotten a couple of serious emails and a lot of funny emails, and we'll respond to all of your emails. So if you have something that you think we should know, or you like Lawrence coaches you and you want to mess with him in some way, so you like send him a very long, detailed email with a bunch of pictures of geese.
Wait, stop encouraging them.
You should yeah. So you should send us emails and stuff. We're lonely. Okay, so another thing. So again, submit an iTunes review if you haven't already, saying what good the good stuff that you like about this podcast, so that when people type in debate podcast, this just, if you do that now, like a bunch of random other stuff pops up on iTunes. But if you guys send some positive reviews, then maybe more debaters that haven't discovered us yet can do that. Remember to like our Facebook page and Twitter account and etc. And one more thing, our sponsor Victory Briefs is amazing. Now should be around the time when you all are going to sign up for debate camp, and a lot of the VBI alumni are become some of the best debaters in the country. That's been true historically, and I'm really excited to work there. Thank them very much for sponsoring this podcast as always, and for their eternal gratitude, love, and support and respect and words. Lawrence, how do you feel about love, respect, and Victory Briefs?
It's amazing how much love and respect and support comes from Victory Briefs, and money, that too. Plus, we're about to roll out a few more articles about the curriculum updates this year at Victory Briefs, so stay tuned for those.
Wow, I am actually interested in that. So, am I?
Yeah, because I interviewed you for it.
Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot. Okay, so this is an Art of War episode. Today we're going to be discussing the second affirmative rebuttal, or the 2AR as it's known in the common parlance. And this is an Art of War episode, and that means we're going to talk about strategy, how you do that. There will be some talk that will be mechanically, aka like a choreography episode. This is sort of a fusion of both of those, but in reality we're going to be saying what are the sorts of things you should be thinking about for the second affirmative rebuttal. How should you organize it? When you're affirmative, it's one of the most important speeches in the entire debate, and this entire episode is dedicated down to how to give that little 3-minute important slice of life what it deserves. So stay tuned for that. If you're still tuned in after that long gap and the beautiful transition, which Lawrence has by now inserted into its appropriate place, we are going to, throughout this episode, have 3 sort of main segments, and these segments are tips for the 2AR, and they like blend together a little bit, but mostly they're separate, and so we're going to talk about them each in turn. We're going to pepper some war stories in there, of course. So that's the agenda for the podcast. And the first one of these things, the first main tip that we have for the 2AR, the first thing that you really need to be considering, is that storytelling is important. Lawrence, what do you mean when you wrote storytelling here? What is storytelling?
Well, in sort of an obvious answer, it's a telling of a story, but I guess more specifically, it's wrapping up the debate in a very simple to understand, overarching, big picture sort of way, where instead of focusing on tiny, minute, sort of pointless details in the debate, you instead focus on the overall thesis or story or debate argument that you are selling to the judge at the end of the debate. And it's about making all of that come together in one singular cohesive narrative that the judge can easily translate into a few sentences on the ballot and reasons for why they're voting affirmative.
So this is what people in debate sometimes call the big picture, right?
Yeah, just
what is the big picture for the debate? Not like how many paint specks are on this farmer's hat, but like what is the overall, what's happening in the painting, with the painting being like the world and like your case. not getting bogged down in minor details, that can be truly truly devastating. And one key thing that you have to realize is that one of the chief advantages of the 2AR is attention. You have the judge's full attention, and you are going to be the last thing that they'll remember in the debate. Now, this is an advantage. It's actually a huge advantage because you can determine what the judge is going to focus on at the end of the round, but not if you insert a bunch of useless drivel, even if they're important for the debate. From your perspective, if the judge doesn't understand that as sort of like contributing to what you're saying about why you should win the debate, then it's honestly just like not even worth your time.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
In a previous episode, we talked about evidence comparison and sort of focusing on annoying details of evidence comparison, like your professor is only a PhD from Columbia, but mine's is from Harvard, so it's better. And it amazes me how many 2ARs will waste time sort of doing these sort of pointless comparisons and focusing on these narrow details that will never win or lose them around. Like 2ARs will go out of their way to reassert, oh, no, my professor is from Harvard, therefore they are qualified, more so than this random indictment that they have against my author and why they may not be qualified. And it's amazing to me how many debaters will spend the 2AR focusing in on that narrow detail instead of caring about the big picture, instead of focusing the last word, as you were talking about earlier, on the important part of the debate.
Okay, so I think this is very good advice, but I also think that it's advice that kind of gets told to people, and it is assumed that they know what they're supposed to do on the basis of that. And I don't think that that's like entirely true. Like, it's easy to tell people, oh, debate for the big picture.
Yeah.
It's much more difficult to give them sort of specific pieces of advice, and it's much harder to do. But there was one thing that you said kind of earlier that I want you to maybe expand upon a little bit. What did you mean by a, quote, cohesive narrative, end quote? Like, what are you saying? What are you doing there?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people sort of make the mistake of treating each argument sort of too mechanistically as an individual piece on the flow, and they just have to win every single one of those pieces of arguments or, arguments on the flow to win. When instead, these arguments only sell the general or support for the general argument or the general thesis that you're trying to sell at the end of this debate to the judge, which is ultimately, to oversimplify it, vote affirmative, affirm the resolution. And at the end of the debate, it's not about whether or not you have won a few small technical arguments here and there on the flow. It's about whether or not the judge thinks that there's a coherent reason or cohesive, strong reason to vote affirmative at the end of the debate. It doesn't matter if you're winning like a few small arguments. If you can't piece that together as part of the argument or the thesis that you were selling at the end of the debate.
So, I think that that's exactly right. And one of the things that I think gets in the way of people doing this is kind of like, look, from a flow perspective, there are a lot of points that people need to quote unquote win, end quote. I don't know if saying quote unquote and then saying end quote is redundant. It probably is. Oh well. Too late now. There are points that you can win a debate. But remember, you have the judge's attention. You want them at all times to be thinking about a reason to vote affirmative. If you at all detract from that, if you don't explain, why your point is relevant to why you win the debate, why it's relevant to proving that the resolution is true or false, these things, they won't do you any good. So I think one of the sort of key tangible implementations of what we're telling you is whenever you make a point in the 2AR, it is super important that you connect that point to you winning the debate.
Yeah.
So for example, let's say, because here's where I think people get hung up. They're like, look, my key argument against their response to my case is that my study is newer. Am I not supposed to bring up this quote-unquote minor detail? Um, but really, it's all a question of like how you phrase it. So, Lawrence, can you like maybe think of a way of phrasing the "my evidence is newer" thing in a way that would be bad, and then also in a way that would be good?
So I think a lot of people sort of do it. Maybe we wouldn't call it bad, but the in unstrategic way or the less than optimal route, because it's good to win that your evidence is newer. But a lot of 2ARs that I've listened to are just like, all right, so off the second contention, they said that my evidence is old, but my evidence is in fact newer because it's from 2015, whereas theirs is from 2013. Next. And that sort of ends it, where they've probably technically won the argument that their evidence is newer because they factually pointed out that it is newer. But that at no point does anything for a judge who cares little about why your evidence matters, as we talked about this in the evidence comparison episode. Whereas I think that one way to do it is to sort of impact the quality of your evidence directly to the strength of the argument and why the argument that you're using or that you're using that evidence to support directly affirms the resolution. So, for example, talk about housing. You read a piece of evidence from 2015 that says that is newer than their 2013 evidence. It says that a right to housing does in fact work to decrease homelessness. And that is why we ought to guarantee a right to housing. Insert sort of your explanation there. But a lot of people will just sort of stop and just be like, so I have some newer evidence about housing. It's from 2015. Next. And that's not really part of the story. That's not really winning the big picture.
Yeah, that's exactly true. I did want to say that. So you said a judge that kind of doesn't care about that. I wanted to mention. So what Lawrence was not saying was that you should do this only in front of lay judges. What Lawrence was saying was that whenever in front of whatever caliber judge you have, if you don't tell them why an issue is important, they don't care about it, no matter how good of a judge you believe that they are. This isn't one of those, straight up adaptation things. This is just like, how do you give a good second affirmative rebuttal? And the reality is that telling a story where all of the roads lead to voting affirmative is more likely to get you there in front of any judge. Why is what you're saying matter to the debate? But not just why does it matter for you winning the argument, why does it matter to affirming the resolution? At the end of the second affirmative rebuttal, you need to have convinced the judge to vote affirmative. You need to convince them that the resolution is true, that the resolution is a good idea. And if any of your points are detracting or, even worse, just ignoring the issue entirely, they make the 2AR seem stale. They make the 2AR seem inappropriate to the debate. They make it seem like it was a 2AR to a debate that was not, in fact, happening, or that it wasn't important. So I see that you've written here that emotional appeals are one of the key things that work well about storytelling in the 2AR. So when you are, again, storytelling, we're selling a narrative. That's the key thing. And by narrative, you mean a series of kind of causes and effects, things that happen. All the roads of everything that you say leads to vote AF because, vote AF because. Why do emotional appeals maybe work well to craft a narrative of that sort of story?
Well, so I think we talked a lot about this in our judge adaptation episode, which is the first one that we put out. But I think there are a few reasons for why emotional appeals work really well here. So the first is that a lot of arguments in debate are in fact pretty mechanistic. They're just, premise, conclusion, that's your argument. You've done the work to make an argument. Please vote AF, judge. And as Martin was talking about earlier, well, judges probably won't care until you tell them to care. And be it as it is, like whether or not this is good or bad, most judges aren't probably paying that much attention to your debate because they are in fact human beings. They have limited attention spans. You're probably the 8th debate of the day they judge. And the easy way to get the judge to care and to focus on the story that you're telling is to make that story relatable to them in some way. And one of the easiest ways to bridge that is using emotions, or as we talked about in the judge adaptation episode, pathos. And as we talked about there, the reason for why pathos is good is because it builds that human empathy connection between you and your judge. And suddenly people have more reason to care. So for example, on this housing topic, people will just be like, vote affirmative. It reduces homelessness. That is good under utilitarian calculus. And that's sort of the end of the 2AR. And it's a good argument to make. Certainly, most affirmatives should be, in fact, talking about reducing homelessness. But to most judges, it's just an argument. It's not really too story-like. It doesn't have much connection to them. So debaters who take the extra step to make it an emotional appeal, to be like, homelessness is really bad. People that you walk by on the street suffer affronts to their dignity. They're unable to attain jobs. They live in poverty. They are dehumanized. They are treated as less than human. All of these things help connect a very abstract issue for a lot of people, like homelessness, into a real thing.
Oh, I thought
that
you were just
judges care about.
I thought you were just describing your apartment conditions.
Oh,
Just like, squalor.
nah, I just bought these new Philips Hue lights. It's pretty awesome.
Philips Hue lights?
Yeah, so like the flickering that you saw earlier in my room was just me controlling my lights with my phone.
Oh, I thought that was just like our video quality being bad.
Oh, no.
You can actually just mess with lights in your phone. Lawrence, how do you have money to spend on stupid stuff like that?
That was my TFA money right there.
Wow. All right. All
But
right. Oh man.
yeah. So just to wrap up the long rant, basically.
People on this podcast do not donate any money to Lawrence Zhao. He will spend it on fancy light switches. Anyway, back to what you were saying.
To end long rant is basically a story is an uninteresting story if it doesn't have an emotional connection to it. Most people don't care about stories that are bland, boring, just facts. Even history books know this, and they have emotional parts into the story when they're telling the story of history. And you, as a debater, are selling a story as well that ultimately ends up concluding, you should vote affirmative. And making those emotional connections really helps in selling a story, especially one that relies on you convincing another human being to vote for your side.
Yeah, I actually really like that, and I've never quite heard, put it this way before. But here's a really good way to think about it. The 2AR, no matter how you slice it, is a story.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
At the end of the debate, that's what the judge has for why you vote affirmative. All of the 40 minutes of debating you've had culminate, at that point. And if the story you give is boring, it's disconnected, it doesn't make sense, you're just much less likely to win than if your story is good. Given that you're, telling a story anyway, it might as well be decent.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean.
So a debater that I was coaching last year at Nationals from my old high school, one of the things that we focused a lot on at the beginning of the topic was, topic research. We delved into most of the articles. We had hours and hours of Skype calls just talking about the sort of nuances of the topic literature. But by the time we got closer to Nationals, we were focusing a lot on storytelling for the 2AR especially. And the topic that year was resolve something along the lines of immigration not to be considered or recognized as a human right or something like that. And as it turns out, this debater himself was an immigrant. He was born in a Southeast Asian country and was adopted by American parents. And one of the things that we talked about and focused on for the 2AR was having, the technical arguments there, just like here's why, logically speaking, there is a human right to immigration, and presented arguments from an ethical perspective for why that was the case. But one of the key things that made this story so much more convincing, capturing, connecting to other human judges who had heard already, a dozen rounds on this topic and could care less about this debate, was an insertion of a narrative of his life as an immigrant, as well as his experiences with other immigrants. One of the arguments that he would make was if there's not a human right to immigration, why does the person that I was born a block down from in that Southeast Asian country, why do they have to live a life of poverty merely because they were unfortunate enough to be born in that country? And would talk about his own human experiences. And he won a ton of AF debates because he had good arguments, but he sold a better story using these emotional appeals, and convinced judges in the end to care more about what he was saying and to vote affirmative.
I'm going to ask the question, which is on all of our mounts. How'd they do?
He placed third at Nationals. Lost to.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, legitimately, when I was sitting at the Victory Roost table, and he was just hanging out there with me, we had a judge come up who was like, "Yeah, your story almost moved me to tears," and I was like, "Dang, I didn't know he had that. I didn't know he had that in them." And it turns out he.
Oh, I remember that kid.
Yeah.
I saw him once or something. He was huddled around you a couple times.
This short Asian kid, yeah. It turns out he had actually been practicing speaking poetry and stuff in order to get better at this emotional appeal stuff. which was interesting. But yeah, that was one thing that we really worked on near the end
Wow, Lawrence is
of
just like
Nationals Prep.
Lawrence is just like a samurai master. He is just like read the poetry.
Oh, I didn't recommend he did that. He just did that all on his own.
I like the image of you as just like an Asian kung fu master though. Like it's just like very very
Except
awesome.
that it's not physical kung fu because I'm horribly
Yeah.
weak. Just
But
debate kung fu.
I'm just like imagining, back to those like cheesy movies where it's like, oh, you want to learn self-control. Well, like, sit on this, you want to be a good swordsman, just like sit on this mountain and like the young impatient trainee is like, why do we have to balance this pebble on my hand for 8 hours a day? And it's like, it's like it'll get you better, and then like you learn patience and like he becomes a good warrior. I'm imagining that that's what you did.
Nah, we just Skyped for hours on end.
All right, well, same thing. We will Skype for hours on end. I don't know what that accent was. It was definitely just like a. Oh well, it was bad. Okay, so key things. Stories are going to happen no matter what. How do you tell a good story? You tell a narrative. You say what happened. Then that has to be emotional. Everything has to connect to why vote affirmative. One other key thing that I wanted to mention here was that kind of like exactly how a narrative should go down. Because remember that we talked about a cohesive narrative. And cohesive here means a couple things. First of all, it means that they should all be reasons to vote affirmative. But we wouldn't consider it really like a cohesive narrative if I just like stood up in the 2AR and gave you three completely separate, disconnected reasons to vote affirmative. Like they had nothing to do with each other. That might be a decent 2AR, but it's not like a great 2AR. And the key thing for having any story, as a lot of people know, is that although stories have dominant sort of multiple different things going on at the same time, there is usually like one sort of dominant, I don't want to necessarily say theme, but like a sort of feeling that you get, a sort of like tone that you get, and that has to be the same kind of throughout what you're saying. Now, let's put this in the context of debate. Really what you're saying is that your points should blend together. And by that I mean not like they should be the same thing.
Yeah, please no.
But I mean that like when you say a point, then and you transition into the next point, explain why your first point is important in light of your second point, and why your third point is important in light of these other things. So for example, let's say your first voting issue is that you're winning, that like homelessness is the worst thing, so you outweigh your opponent's stuff. You're just like homelessness is the worst, etc., etc., etc. And then you're like, this plays into my second voting issue of rights being the best way to solve homelessness, right? Instead of just saying voting issue 1, homelessness is bad, voting issue 2, rights are good, right? Like those things can seem separate. What you want to do is use transition words and phrases to connect your voting issues together. And at the end of the 2AR, you need to say like, first voting issue was this, that's why I proved this. That plays into the second voting issue, which was this, which plays into the third voting issue, which was this. Together, this is a sentence about why you should vote affirmative.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's not to say like, as Martin was talking about earlier, you can't have separate voting issues. Like, for example, this phrase "even if" is always a phrase that you can use. Just as long as your "even if" isn't like a totally disconnected from everything that you're saying. It's just about connecting everything together. Cohesive stories can have even ifs, so don't be afraid to use those as well.
Yeah, even if also gives judges the sense that your bases are just covered. They're like, wow, he has secured himself against attack.
Exactly.
Or at least, I mean, I don't know if judges actually think that way. I've never heard a judge say that, but
I think it's not even like. I think it does give the perception of sort of complete dominance, but it also I think is just more.
You and I,
but I think even for just like the normal judge, it's like straight up that they vote on different things. So like my junior year at nationals in round like 12, I think I was negative, and I wasn't sure how this round had turned out. And after the 2AR, because it was like a little bit of a messy round, and it turns out to have been a 3-0 for the negative. And I looked at the ballots, and they were all completely different. So one of them wasn't flowing, one of them was flowing horizontally, so like drew the boxes and lines on a single piece of legal paper, and one of them was flowing like a real person, and they all
A
gave
real human being.
yeah,
Jeez.
like
The beats.
and all three of them had given totally different voting issues or reasons they voted negative, and they were each, I think, like I'd given three negative voting issues, and each one of them had voted on a different one, and one of them was an even if sort of thing. So like I think it's good for that reason.
I forget if I've told this story on the podcast. Did I tell the story from CFL Nationals in my junior year on the podcast? Not the one about being in elims and trying to tell them to vote on a criterion, which they didn't. But I mean the prelim one about there being different decisions in all of the rounds, but like one of the key decisions being really interesting. I don't remember. Well, whatever. Even if I have, you'll have to endure it again. So I'm debating in like round 4 of the CFL national tournament, the great CFL national tournament, home to probably some of my best debate stories because of the very interesting judging and competing experience that I had there. So I was debating against someone, and I was affirmative. I read my case, she read her case in the 1AR, I extended some stuff, said that she didn't answer it because she basically dropped the whole case. My opponent then made up a bunch of new responses to the case. They weren't very good, but they were like a couple of new ones. And then in the 2AR, I was just like, by the way, there were a bunch of arguments in the 2AR or 2N that were new. Remember rule in Lincoln Douglas, no new arguments in the second speech, but they're bad anyway, and I proceeded to go and try to win. The CFL National Tournament is unique in that all of the rounds are prelims. Sorry, that didn't make
Yes,
sense.
every one of them.
Yeah,
Finals is just
sorry.
a prelim. It's pretty cool.
What I meant was every judge was paneled. Not every judge.
They were just composed of panels.
Yes, every judge was made of solar panels. But no, what I mean is every preliminary round has 3 judges deciding it, and so keep that in mind. So the panel is there, and I finished my 2AR, and before I can like leave and like pack up or whatever, my opponent, in front of all the judges, is just like, "Excuse me, I'm sorry, opponent. I'm from Maine, where we like don't know a lot of random debate stuff. Is it actually a rule that you're not allowed to make new arguments in the 2N?" And I just said the word yes. I just said the word yes, and that's all I said. Then I packed up my stuff and exited the round. Now, fast forward. Now, I'm looking at the ballots from this tournament. And so it turns out that I had won that round on a 3-0 decision.
Nerd.
But all the decisions were different. One judge was like, said something that didn't make sense but voted for me. Another judge said something different that didn't make sense and voted for me. And then the third one simply said, negative concedes after debate.
What?
Yep. So
what?
So this judge apparently thought that like little exchange that we had at the end, where she was like, "Hey, can I make new arguments?" I'm like, "No." She thought that was like a concession, or he did actually. It was a dad. I assume it's a dad. Hopefully, it's not a coach. But yeah, so just goes to show, people can vote for you for different reasons, including they believe your opponent conceded.
So yeah, I mean, bringing it back, I guess, to the point that we're making, cohesive stories are good, but it doesn't mean that those cohesive stories can't be warranted from multiple perspectives, so long as they're tied back to a singular story that you are selling at the end of the debate. It's not 3 separate stories for why you vote AF. It's one story for why you vote AF, warranted or explained by a few different arguments that fit together.
Okay, so we think we've given you like a pretty good overarching or arcing, I'm not sure, theory of sort of how to think about storytelling in the 2AR. We have 2 specific tips about how to do that were different from like the ones that we like to try before, kind of just like miscellaneous tips. one of them is one of them is that you should use words and phrases that you've used before in the debate. And that's because the judge remembers what you were saying at the beginning of the speech. It gives them a sense of closure to tie that back into the end of the speech. That way it doesn't feel like your story changes. The story was there all the time, and we'll talk about that later. But the general idea is, in the 2AR, use words and phrases from your narrative that you've said before. And here's the thing. You really want to, like, repeat a couple of words and phrases and important ways of putting things throughout the entire debate. The most powerful way of putting something. And that your 2AR should be the version of that that makes its way onto the ballot. Lawrence, you wrote here, your 2AR should be what the judge writes on the ballot. Can you explain what that means in the context of what I just said?
Well, so yeah, it's like a strong piece of advice that my old coach gave me, and I think I give it to a lot of people now. It's like, if you're doing the 2AR correct, if the story that you're selling is accurate, then the last 30 seconds or so of the 2AR should be sort of word for word what the judge writes on their ballot. You've correctly diagnosed how the round has played out, and you have sold the most effective and compelling story in the debate, and so the judge writes that down. And using words and phrases that you've said before is the key thing to making it a story that the judge wants to write down on the ballot. And I guess like one way of thinking about it is it'd be kind of weird if you were reading all of the Harry Potter books and then at the end of book 7, J.K. Rowling just shifts the tone entirely, like switches it, the point of view, and then starts using like random words that she hadn't been using before. And instead of like the spell for disarming being Expelliarmus, it was now just like Disarmify or something like that. Like if that happened, then it wouldn't be a very good story to sell at the end of the debate. And so using the words and phrases you've said before and translating that into the last couple of seconds of the 2AR and having that be what the judge writes on the ballot is an effective way at telling a story.
Exactly. So the second tip that we have here, and this one is important, we kind of wanted to address something that... So there is a school of thought on the second affirmative rebuttal that goes something like this. You shouldn't talk about anything that your opponent has said in the debate. You need to tell your story, and it's important that you tell your story in the best way that you can, which involves completely ignoring what your opponent has said in the 2N. What you should do is you have the last word, hope that the judge forgets about the words that your opponent has said, and just try to be really persuasive for 3 minutes and hope that it works out. Now, I see some all caps words here that I wrote about why that's bad. Would you mind putting some all caps volume to those phrases?
I don't think my voice goes any louder than it currently does, but I can try. You should talk about what your opponent said. It is really bad when you don't.
Okay. Now that Lawrence's all caps voice has been immortalized for all time, would you like to expand on that a little bit? And like why not?
I mean, so there are some top debaters who have done this. I've witnessed it happen before, although generally not to me, and I've definitely never done this myself. But don't confuse the few successful people that got away with not talking about anything that the negative said in their last speech with good strategy, because people do bad things all the time and still win debates. That's not something that you should take away and copy and emulate. The thing is that judges aren't quite that stupid. They, in fact, remember what the negative has said, and to entirely avoid everything that the negative speech has said is just a recipe to lose both like parent and, sort of tech flow, qualified, whatever you want to call them, judges. Because to the parent judges, it just looks like that you have no idea how to argue. You have no idea how to engage your opponent. You've just decided to ignore everything that's happened. Even ones who aren't flowing can at least recall general ideas that the negative has brought up. And if you just talk about none of them, that's just like, oh, wait, I thought this was a debate. And to any reasonable flow tech judge, they're obviously not going to vote for you in those debates. Like, I shouldn't have to explain that part.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Your opponent has a story too, right? Like the 2N has a story. It's a little longer. They could spend more time on their story than yours.
Yeah.
So to speak. Like, at least the 2N is longer than the 2AR. Now, again, I think that the affirmative is still advantaged in the storytelling aspect. However, it's undeniable. Your opponent has a story. And you can't just pretend like they didn't say the story to the judge. What you need to do, and this is the key thing, is your story needs to involve their story. It needs to kind of falsify their story. It needs to paint a different picture, and you need to acknowledge where the pictures diverge. So you might want to say something like, if your opponent's, one of their key voting issues was that, like, homelessness isn't that bad, for example, which is not really a good voting issue to have, but let's imagine that it was. So what you do is you'd start telling your story about why homelessness is bad, and you'd be like, my opponent seems to think on their voting issue, on their story, that homelessness doesn't have an impact. That ignores sort of centuries of frustration and losses of human dignity as a result of the homelessness crisis. The key point of clash is homelessness good, bad, and well, you wouldn't say that, but you would say something like, now, what the affirmative believes is that homelessness is bad. We've given you all these graphic examples to support that. That's one of those things that your ballot will hinge on. And that way, you say to the judge, look, this is a debate. This isn't just competitive oratory, right? We don't just read our own speeches and ignore everything that the opponent has said. We acknowledge that there is a story you're presenting of the issue. There's a story that we're presenting of the issue. Our story is better, specifically. So one of the things that means, by the way, is talking specifically about their voting issues. They'll have voting issues. Maybe there probably won't be like 7 of them. And if there are, don't line by line them. That seems stupid. But if they're just like, my 3 voting issues are blah, 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 what you can do is tie your voting issues into their voting issue. Be like, my opponent says in their second voting issue that, the following thing is true. However, this voting issue that I have sort of neatly takes that out. And what you also want to do is remember, again, this is a debate. What the judge is looking for is points of disagreement. Where do the affirmative and negative believe different things? Where do they believe different things? And, locate that. Say, this is their voting issue. This is my voting issue. The reason they're different is they believe something different than I believe, but you should think that I'm right about my thing. Okay, so rant over. Do you have any war stories about storytelling that you particularly wanted to use?
I think the Sean examples earlier were pretty good. Oh, wait, Sean was the name of the kid that I was coaching at Nationals. I want to say, though, that, like, it's not to say that your speech should focus on everything that the negative said.
Right, yeah.
And nor does it mean that you have to, be really specific about, like, every argument that was made in the 2NR, because obviously only certain issues are voting issues, and those are the ones that you want to focus on. So when I was affirming most of my senior year, the 2AR would very frequently sort of go above the flow, and it wasn't to say that it would ignore the flow, because it obviously talked about negative voting issues, but rather it was to say that instead of focusing on the bogged down minutia technical details of, like, every argument that was made must answer it, it was like, here's the 3 best negative arguments that they have to win. And, like, if I don't win these arguments, or I don't beat back these arguments, I'll lose. I'll address them sort of in instead of a very line by line fashion, just an overview type fashion. So, like, this negative argument about X, and then instead of being like 1, 2, 3, like I would in the 1AR, and being, like, very technical pointy about it, it would just be, here's the overarching true argument that I'm going to extend for why this argument is incorrect, and instead you should believe my story that I'm selling at the end of the debate.
Yep. I told stories a lot, and the specific way that I told stories I'm going to get into kind of like later on in the podcast. But one thing that I did, I remember a specific debate that I did where where basically the affirmative had me kind of dead to rights on a lot of issues. The 1AR was particularly good. Um, However, one thing that I did was I had this one argument about crime. Or sorry, the negative had me
Oh, okay, I was confused there.
had me dead to rights. I had this one argument about crime, and I knew the argument very well, um, but like it was basically one of the only things that I was like conclusively ahead on. So in the 2AR, I just spun every argument as it related to crime. Every argument that the negative had made, I looked at it through the lens of crime. It's like, they might be right about increased safety, but will there really be safety when criminals are invading our homes? Stuff like that. So, and I won that debate. So, it's easy to convince Florida people that crime is bad.
I mean, have you Googled Florida recently? Like all of the crimes that are committed in Florida, like the ridiculousness of them are unimaginable. Like there's like a meme of Florida man.
Do you have the Twitters?
I don't use it.
Oh well. So I have a Twitter account that I use mostly to follow Magic the Gathering professional players. True story.
What a
but yeah, what a nerd. Hey, you all listening to this here debate podcast. I hope you're comfortable with your nerdiness by now. But so I follow the Florida Man Twitter account, which is just like the caption is like the world's worst superhero, and they just like take headlines of Florida people doing like very stupid, usually crimes or things, and they caption them like Florida Man does this, as if it's just like a superhero, but it's really terrible. It really helps convince you what a great slice of the South Florida is.
Truly amazing.
There was that guy that like ate people's faces off after eating bath salts. Is that right?
Yeah, that was a popular one. There was one where like some guy would just like rang a doorbell and then just like stabbed the guy who answered it and then just like ran off and then like did horribly inappropriate things in the woods or something like that. Ugh.
Well, I mean, that just sounds like every every day.
In Florida? Okay. Well,
one of those. We are one of those quote unquote states. Okay, so we are going to leave you for a few seconds. You'll listen to some pleasing jazz, and then we'll come back for our second tip. So the second tip that we have for you all is less is more. Now, Lawrence, what does less is more mean?
Well, it's actually mathematically incorrect because by definition more is more. But I suppose what this mathematically
Lawrence,
incorrect statement.
Are you disparaging Sir Alan Moore?
Oh, is that who said this? I guess
yeah, because that's good because Sir Alan Moore is definitely lesser than Sir Gracie Wickham, the British secret agent and nuclear physicist.
Oh, okay. Well, today I learned. Anyways, the general point is that quantity does not equal quality, and in this, especially in the 2AR, less is more, because going for a few well-explained arguments that feed the overall story that you're trying to sell is way more effective than blitzing out a bunch of blippy arguments that are unexplained and not properly interacted with negative arguments, and you will lose debates if you don't properly collapse or strategically select the few arguments that you want to take the time to explain very well, as opposed to the 20 arguments that you will go for that you will not explain very well.
So there were a lot of words in there that I think are important to understand your point, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of like ask you to explain some of them. So the first one, go for. What does it mean to go for, quote unquote, an argument?
Extend
as opposed to what?
Oh, well, to go for means to extend this argument into the final speech or continue to make and forward this argument in later speeches. So you should not go for every argument, or you should not extend every argument that was made in the 1AR. You should instead pick a few of the arguments that you want to go for, or extend into the 2AR.
When you were saying like when you were going for an argument, like would you consider it going for an argument if I just sort of mentioned that I had a second contention and then moved on?
And well, so no, because well, actually yes, you have gone for it, but you would have gone for it terribly, which is the point of less is more. That you can go for 20 arguments, but it's a bad idea because they're all going to be underexplained. They're all going to be not compelling. They're not going to feed a central story that you're trying to sell at the end of this debate. So you could go for, I guess, mentioning I had a second contention, but that is not going to be a very persuasive argument to very many.
Yeah, so that's right. You mentioned the word blippy. So I take it by blippy you mean quick, underexplained?
Yeah, exactly. There's blippy arguments, which is just a jargony term for short, underexplained arguments that are typically about a sentence long that typically fail to meet the criteria for a full argument. That is, they do not have a claim, warrant, and impact. Instead, they're usually just a claim.
Yeah, so for blippy arguments, like that kind of like has the connotation of like kind of like a blip in speech. Like it was about like 5 seconds long, or like you look at your flow and it's like 2 words because the argument was like a very short amount of segments. Those are blippy, as in they're they're kind of like blips on like I don't know like a radar like a Morse code thing. They're just like very small, underdeveloped. When you use the phrase underdeveloped, what exactly does that mean? Like, what's the difference between an argument that is underdeveloped and an argument that is not?
That is, oh, so I guess it's best to contrast. An underdeveloped argument is an argument that lacks the proper explanation to the judge, as well as the proper interaction done with competing negative arguments that have been advanced. Whereas a developed argument would contain what many would consider all three basic parts of an argument, which is a claim, warrant, and impact. An underdeveloped argument might have a claim and a warrant, but it typically lacks an impact because the debater advancing this underdeveloped argument does not take the time to explain this argument in a meaningful way, as well as interact it in a meaningful way.
Yeah, so that's another word that you used that this is the last one that I'd like you to explain. What does it mean to interact an argument?
So it means that, as we were talking about earlier, arguments don't exist in a vacuum. They, in fact, are part of a story that is being contested by the other opponent who is attempting, not the other opponent, the other person who I guess is the opponent. You only have one opponent.
The other opponent, public forum debate.
Yeah, who's not only
Lawrence's public forum debate experience is coming back to haunt us. Anyway, go on.
I think at this point it's the policy debate, but public forum too. I've judged a lot of it recently, actually. Anyways, the other opponent is not only attempting to contest the validity and coherence of your story, but also attempting to forward their own story as well. And to interact it means to take the time to explain how your argument is still true or functions or is relevant in a world in which the negative story is true as well. So, for example, if your affirmative argument is homelessness is bad, a right to housing would solve it, and stop homelessness, or at least reduce a significant portion of it. And the negatives argument is, well, you don't have a right to housing because only negative rights exist, as we talked about in the topic analysis episode. If all the affirmative says is, well, homelessness is really bad, so vote AF. Well, that's not meaningfully interacted with this negative argument, which has partially conceded the validity of the affirmative claim. It probably concedes that maybe the affirmative would reduce housing. That doesn't mean that it's a right. So you have to take the extra step of interacting your claim with their claim, which is that not only does it reduce homelessness, it is more important than the competing argument that the negative is.
So you kind of just put it in context, right? Like the context of what your opponent has said is relevant, of course.
Exactly.
And what you're saying is, in the context of their thing, you should consider my thing. And another way of putting it is kind of like clash, right? It's like clash. Like you have ideas, they have ideas, those ideas conflict at some level. Otherwise, one of you wouldn't be AF and one of you wouldn't be neg.
Or you're just both really bad.
Yeah, I mean, like it's totally possible for your opponent to just like read an affirmative case and hope you don't notice. which I've basically seen before, which was good. Okay, so into the nitty gritty. So let's say your opponent has kind of like three main voting issues in the debate. So about how many arguments should I make against each of those negative voting issues in the second affirmative rebuttal?
So it's hard to answer in a vacuum because obviously it's context dependent. Maybe some arguments, might need more than one. But in general, I would not make any more than like two responses against any given negative voting issue in the 2AR because I might have had three, maybe even four responses to it in the 1AR. But I'm going for one or two of those arguments. I'm extending one or two of the responses that I've made against this voting issue because I've deemed those to be the strongest in this debate, and the ones that I want to take the time to invest in and explain why they take out or answer the negative voting issue. So instead of going for like three or four, I'm only going to go for one or two.
You say one or two. I'm pretty on the one camp.
Yeah, and so am I sometimes. But like, as I said, it's sort of context dependent because like some debates, like I would only go for one. In fact, my senior year, around 12 of nationals, I was hitting this debater who actually I knocked out of nationals the previous year as a junior, so I felt really bad for this kid because I kept on hitting him at nationals despite the fact that he was from like South Carolina or something. Then my junior year at nationals, my 2AR functionally only extended one argument to take out two or three of the negatives voting issues because I thought that explaining this one argument well would take out his voting issue. So his argument was something along the lines of the affirmative the affirmative will likely lead to an abuse of a surveillance policy because it was the national surveillance versus digital privacy topic. And the argument that I chose to go for, because I thought it was undercovered by the negative and not properly addressed, was that this doesn't dispute the truth value of the resolution. It merely proves that the affirmative should be constrained and implemented in a better way, but it doesn't deny that that doesn't deny the truth value because of some abuse that is not inherent to the system. And I gave some example of how, yes, the police might be really bad sometimes, and they have commit acts of police brutality, but that's not an argument against the police. That is an argument against the sort of like that is an argument against police brutality. Similarly, that surveillance becomes abused is not an argument against surveillance. That is an argument against the abuse of surveillance. And the negative has not taken the time to connect those two things together.
And the importance of this though was that was basically the only argument that you went for.
Yes, and I spent like probably a full minute explaining this argument in the 2AR, saying, look, they can be correct about this, but that doesn't dispute the fact that in a moral sense, surveillance should still, or security should override abstract claims to privacy, because despite potential for abuse, those are only claims against abuse, not claims against the value of security. And I explained this argument for like a full minute instead of going for multiples. But in other debates, I would have gone for like two arguments against every single voting issue, although never more than two. So as I said, it's context dependent.
Yeah, I tended to just say one thing on whatever it is that it's possible. Now, sometimes you're in really dire straits. So I remember very vividly one debate that I had, and I don't remember whether I was affirmative or negative. This was my novice year, kids. This was like a bajillion years ago. But
Martin's really old.
I am so old. I'm like 85. I'm basically 85. I'm 85 on the inside and on the outside. So one thing that I remember was that I remember my opponent was like pretty decisively beating me on everything except for like one criterion warrant. There was this one criterion warrant that I like thought I was like decisively right about. And I was just like, Martin, I'm just going to talk about this for the entire speech. So I just took this like one criterion warrant and I was like, this is super important, I'm winning it, so vote for me. And I just spent the entire speech on it. Now, looking back on it, this was like not really a good plan because the thing I was going for wasn't really a reason why the resolution was accurate or inaccurate even. I just knew that this was the argument that I was ahead on, and I knew that there was some chance that if I talked about it for a really long time and explained it extremely well, that the judges would err on my side, and they did. I actually won that debate. So I also remember what. So here's the thing: when you have one, so here, by the way, is the implied reason not to, as they say, go for quote unquote everything. When you extend 3 arguments against something, that has an opportunity cost. As you all know, you don't have an infinite speech time. You have to decide.
Really?
Yes. Well, Lawrence thinks that he has infinite speech time because he coaches public forum debate, and actually, that those 2 things have nothing to do with each other, but they're just sort of separate ribs on Lawrence. Yeah. So when you have enough time to talk about 3 issues for a very short period of time, you instead use that time to talk about 1 issue for a great length of time. And for all of you circuit debaters out there, this really is very important. It takes a short amount of time to extend an argument, but a long amount of time, longer than you think, to explain an argument enough to actually get a judge to vote on it, including in the most highly technical and quick debates that you can imagine. It really takes a long time to talk about the nuances of an issue enough. So what I have written here is you want to illustrate to the judge your point. You want to show them, not just tell them about the point. And so there's a difference between me saying, for example, free speech rights on college campuses, coddle our students. There is and they've conceded that point, voting issue 1. It's like, that's not going to do it. Instead, what you have to do is spend a little more time on it. You say, free speech restrictions coddle students. Students are made for the real world. That's where eventually everyone will go. But free speech codes are leading to cultures where students leave their college campuses and are dramatically unprepared for life. That makes their lives worse in every one of the manageable ways that they discuss. Instead, we should eliminate speech codes in order to give the right environment for surviving in the real world where students will spend most of their time. Now, putting a point like that has the judge understand the issue from all sides, or they understand kind of the spin you're putting on the issue. Don't just tell them that there's a coddling problem and expect them to figure it out. Instead, going for only one argument or only one of these issues really helps the judge get what's important. And it helps you put emphasis on what you need to put emphasis on. So, yeah, go ahead.
And like one other thing to just randomly add in here, it's like also judges sort of have some intuitive sense of strategy and argument selection, and debaters who just go for everything give off the air that they don't really understand what is going on in this debate. Debaters who collapse or pick very few arguments to explain well in the debate and do so correctly, like they picked the correct arguments to go for, tell the judge that they are the ones who know what is going on in this debate and not their opponent. They have correctly identified the core controversies that have occurred in this debate and spent the last 3 minutes of this debate effectively boiling down those core controversies and going for just those arguments instead of going for extraneous, unnecessary arguments that they don't need to go for. And that perceptually, even to judges who aren't flowing, conveys the message that this is the debater who knows what is going on, and that is why they should win.
Yeah, that's true, especially in front of judges like me. I don't know about Lawrence. I think that if you're debating in front of Lawrence, you should go for like 7 issues in the 2AR, maybe 8 if he looks unhappy.
They should all be new too. They should have no connection to the previous 1AR and the 2AR. You should read a new affirmative case in the 2AR.
We actually got a couple of a reason for decisions at this past Woodward tournament from one judge in particular who did this to like a bunch of our debaters in a row, where she this judge basically like the debate would happen. They would and then they would the affirmative, because my debaters were invariably negative. The affirmative would read a new card in the 2AR, and then this judge would vote affirmative instantly and chastise my debater for not responding to it.
Boom.
This was the same judge and happened multiple times, and I had to be like, look, my debaters, you need to say don't vote on new arguments, presented in the 2, and they would do that, and she would vote on them anyway. It was just a nightmare.
Which isn't to say that you should read new arguments in the 2AR. Actually, you should not do that.
Don't do that.
It turns out the vast majority of judges will hate you for it and will actually probably drop you.
Yeah.
I've seen more than one ballot that's just been this argument's new in the 2AR, you lose. Okay.
It was funny. At my last tournament ever, which was the CFL Nationals tournament my senior year, so I had 3 AF debates. Sorry, no. I had 3 neg debates. And in 2 of those 3 neg debates, most of the 2AR was reading new cards. And
oh my.
Impressively, I only picked up 5 of the 6 ballots. In the last round, one judge voted affirmative somehow. I don't understand this. Yeah. So okay. I think we're kind of we've kind of explained this enough. But I do want to tell some more stories about this. So what I did, there were 2 more times that I can remember where I really exploited the talk about one thing for a very long time. Don't go for too many different things story. So one important thing that I want you all to realize before we go into the story is don't go for everything, or less is more refers to both which of your contentions you extend and what objections to your opponent's contentions and arguments that you extend. It refers to both of those things. Less is more is a philosophy that is applied to everything. Although these two examples will really be kind of indicative of the contention side of things. So the first story. Both of these stories are from the state tournament. So in varsity states, my senior year, I was debating against a very talented Florida debater who's actually one of my good friends, and we were having a debate. Now this judge in particular that we had in that debate was very very strange as a judge. I had her many times on the local Florida circuit, and it took a very sort of strange set of feats to adapt to her. Basically, being affirmative was just a slam dunk, and if you were negative, you really needed to try super hard to try to win the debate. But that's kind of the upshot. There was all sorts of weird stuff that you had to do in front of her. But anyway, so we had this judge, and I had this case with 5 contentions, and one of the contentions was about genocide. And the negative brought up a bunch of framework arguments in the 2AR, talked about the value criterion for a very long time, tried to win that on sort of a very technical level, and tried to win the contention and whatever. Then extended a bunch of stuff against my case, against my various contentions. Didn't really touch the genocide contention very well. Actually, he completely didn't answer it. So what I did in the 2AR was I stood up and I talked about the genocide contention for about 2 minutes and 30 seconds. And I talked about it in the context of international law, which was my opponent's case was basically private military firms, which was the resolution. Resolution was basically private military firms good versus private military firms bad. And I said that private military firms were helped to intervene and prevent genocide. His argument was that private military firms violate international law sometimes. And so my argument was you know what violates international law? Genocide. Genocide violates international law. And I just put my my arguments in the most context. But instead of talking about all these different arguments, I just talked about one contention for the entire speech. Funny story about this debate. So I see my opponent taking what I thought were vigorous notes. They were flowing-ish. They were at least writing down something on their paper, I thought. And I was like, this is interesting. It's the second affirmative rebuttal. Maybe he doesn't necessarily need to write down everything. And so after the debate, we walk out of the classroom, and the debater is like, I drew this caricature of you during the 2AR. And he had just drawn this like very like fat picture of me.
Oh.
Uh, he was just like, God damn it! Like I dropped this contention argument, and he's talking about it for the entire speech in a lay round. Oh my God, my goose is cooked. His goose was cooked. I won that debate easily, but but he was just so mad. He just started drawing a picture of me. Lawrence, has anyone ever drawn a picture of you during your 2AR?
Not during my speech, but certainly at camp, I apparently get memed a lot. There's a lot of random pictures of me drawn in very unflattering ways, although most of them are actually relative accurate depictions of my face, so I guess they're really not that unflattering.
Well, let's just say that this picture that my friend devised was, although inaccurate, closer to the accurate side of things than the inaccurate one. Anyway, so the second story that I had was kind of similar. It's actually from the state tournament my junior year. And this was basically like a huge criterion debate. It was in front of a soccer mom. And we knew it was a soccer mom because everything about her said soccer mom, and she had a bunch of soccer apparel on, and she had like a soccer bag. It was very clear that this was a soccer mom. She also looked sunburned. So I was debating against the infamous Josh Tupler, who would go on to my senior year, beat me in finals of the state tournament. So my junior year, though, he didn't. I was affirmative. I read my case. He responded very well to every framework argument that I had, and it was basically like a framework debate. In the 1AR, I read a new argument on the framework. I basically read a new criterion warrant. Don't do this, kids. But I basically read a new criterion warrant, quote unquote, in response to their criterion warrant. My opponent goes on to like extend their objections to my criterion warrant, drops my new evidence. So in the 2AR, I just talked about the new evidence that I read for 2 minutes. I just said like, this is the key thing. Vote
Sounds
affirmative.
unethical.
It was awesome. No, I mean, I was just like, this is a response to all of my opponent's arguments. Here's a card. And they didn't answer it. And I was just like, this is the most important issue in the debate. It's the only thing I'm going to talk about to convince you that it's important. And then after the debate, we left the room, and Josh, we're good friends. He turns to me, he's just like, you, and then he calls me an expletive. Because he was just like, I didn't answer that, and then Sigalo talked about it for 3 minutes. Hopefully I still win. He didn't. So, talking about one issue for the long time, less is more is really true. This, by the way, is something that tech debaters really need to hear more. Like,
Yeah, it's
so many
pretty
people
bad.
just go for so much stuff. Now, here's the thing. I actually like it's funny. Like, I kind of understand where they're coming from, but I kind of don't, because I would say one of my major benefits as a debater is that when I was in a debate round, I was very lazy. Like, why would you try to win 3 arguments when you could just win 1 and win the debate? It's so much easier. It's so much easier. And it's so much more effective. I just, like, accidentally did the right thing. You know what I mean? I just, like...
Yeah.
I was just like, I wasn't doing it because it was like the most strategic thing. I was just like, well, there's this one issue that I'm ahead on, and if I win that, I win. So I'm just gonna like do that, I guess, for all of my time. Might as well.
Yeah, it's also just like wasted effort. Like, not even just being lazy. Like, why would you expend unnecessary effort? Like, half the debates that I judge, the 2AR goes for like a bunch of arguments, none of which really end up factoring into my decision. A lot of times, especially in the debates where I eventually end up voting affirmative, like very rarely do I consider every single argument that was made in the 2AR because a lot of them were unnecessary. And in the debates where I don't vote affirmative, well, then a lot of the times it's just like, hey, the 2AR should have gone for, like fewer arguments and explained them better.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I don't know. Maybe this is a topic for a future episode. I think that I was maybe a little more used to taking kind of risk in games, and I actually think that as fun as this is to make fun of me for, I do think that trading card games actually played a pretty big part on making me a little more risk prone than I would say a lot of the debaters that I've coached are.
That's fair.
Okay, that's this segment, and on to the next one. Here's a transition. So I hope you all enjoyed that transition. Now, the next thing, the third general tip, is that you should work everything in the debate up to the 2AR. The 2AR is a speech that you need to prepare for by sowing the seeds of the 2AR in every previous speech. Now, Lawrence, how do you do that, and why is it important to do that?
It's a broad question. I think we'll answer it in a couple of different parts under this segment. But the first point of how do you sow sort of the appropriate lingo in the previous speech, I think we talked about a little bit earlier, which is like using rhetoric that was previously in the 1AC and the 1AR to build your 2AR upon is important, as we talked about, for the consistent story.
The which AC? The first one?
The first one, yeah.
Okay. Not the second one.
No, I don't believe there's a second one. Although maybe there could be a second one, and you just read a different affirmative case, and then you collapse to the affirmative case that has the most persuasive appeal by the end of the debate.
That's a good point. I'm sorry, I just had to get that one in there. Continue.
So you should start by picking the sort of phrases, the verbiage, the I guess lingo, in the that were in previous speeches and using those as the building blocks for the 2AR. So one of the ways that this sort of manifests itself is very clear thesis statements. A lot of affirmative cases lack thesis statements, or if they do, they're like highly generic and they don't really carry anything to them. But having, like, for example, a good thesis statement in the affirmative that you consistently extend throughout the debate to the 2AR is like a really good way to do this. As for the part of like, why do we do this? I'll give one answer, and then we can obviously talk about some of the other things that are involved with this question, which is that the 2AR is the speech that wins you the debate. You don't win a debate for having a good affirmative case. Like, everyone could read the same affirmative case. Not everyone would win as the affirmative, because as it turns out, an argument that is well explained in the affirmative case but not well explained in the 2AR very, very rarely wins. An argument that is good in the affirmative case, but you don't recognize the value of it and don't extend it into the 2AR doesn't win you a debate. So having a good affirmative case, or even a good 1AR for that matter, which is hard to do, and that'll be the subject of a future argument clinic episode, it doesn't win you a debate. The 2AR does. And so recognizing that the 2AR is what wins you a debate, is the affirmative, is crucial, because you need to build everything in the first affirmative speech in the case and in the first affirmative rebuttal, the 1AR. You need to build it so that you have the groundwork for a winning 2AR that lets you tell your cohesive story, that lets you make those emotional connections, that lets you pick the key arguments that you want to collapse to, that allows you to ultimately convince the judge to vote affirmative.
Yeah, and that's the important speech, and as you've said, everything should kind of build up to that. And as we mentioned, kind of the repetition of a couple keywords and phrases across the debate is one of those things that's key to that. And as we've also mentioned, having a total disconnect from your previous speeches is not good either. Your speeches that are in the past should complement those in the future. The more times the judge has heard your story, the more likely they are to understand that story, to vote on that story. Again, with the Harry Potter example that Lawrence said, if your story changes in the middle of it or at the end, bad things will result. You've written this thing about it's okay to shift your tone. What does that mean?
Yeah, so one thing that I did as a debater, although this wasn't until the end of my debate career as a senior, is that slight shifts in tone are sort of okay. No one expects the 1AC, the affirmative case, to be like laden with emotion. The first one.
Okay, good.
Yeah, the one that exists in LD.
Thank you for clarifying that it's the first one.
It can be more technical sounding, and in fact it should be, because it should be quoting a lot of academic evidence. It should be, making arguments that are very logically consistent with one another. It should focus really on sort of on the arguments, and because there's no one is saying that in order for a 2AR to have those emotional connections that we talked about earlier, the 1AC must be solely emotional and the 1AR must be solely emotional, so the 2AR can be solely emotional. You can in fact switch the sort of appeal methods that you use. You can switch from a more ethos-y, logos-y 1AC and shift to a more pathos-y 2AR, so long as they're not totally disconnected from each other. And so the way that I would carry this out is to write a very stock affirmative case. It had references to things that could become emotional stories later in the debate, but it's mostly technical, mostly just evidence, mostly just a very straightforward affirmative case. And the 1AR would mostly continue this trend, but it would also introduce some more emotional themes, because the 1AR is short, so you can't make tons of new arguments. So one of the things that I would do is make sort of overview arguments about the truth or falsity of the resolution using emotional appeals, and then the 2AR would explode on them a little bit more. So one topic that I had my senior year to sort of make this a little more concrete was the issue of compulsory voting, whether or not you should be forced to vote in a democracy. Now, so the affirmative case was generally pretty straightforward. It's just like, look, in order for democracy to be preserved, everyone needs to vote. There's a problem with voting now. Democracy lacks legitimacy if it doesn't have it. The 1AR was pretty straightforward. And you might think it's a little hard to make an emotional connection on a topic like this. And you're right, it kind of was. As it turns out, compulsory voting is not a particularly, crying type story. Like, no one gets sad over compulsory voting. But one thing that the affirmative would do, the 2AR would do, was make very emotional type appeals to the intrinsic concept of democracy and explain why it was really important to that judge. Like, democracy is a moral imperative. Without it, we are treated as unequals. This is the only way to protect our freedom, to preserve the very core of what makes America, and just a bunch of unnecessary appeals to the core ideals of democracy, and why compulsory voting was necessary to sustain those, and in a more persuasive manner than simply just making like a boring emotional or emotionless logical case for democracy. And those two speeches, like the 1AC and the 2AR, might sound a little bit different from each other, but I used the 1AR to bridge it and to shift the tone over the course of speeches to give this more emotional appeal in the 2AR. And that's okay. It's just totally disconnecting it and just like randomly in the 2AR reading a new sob story about compulsory voting or something like that is probably not the way to go.
Yeah, that's definitely true. What I found is that, again, with that AC that I have with 5 different contentions my senior year, I had kind of the seeds of I had a lot of very logos kind of appeals in there, and I had each one of them. I had a way to talk about them in a kind of persuasive way, and throughout the debate, those issues could evolve into very different things. One sort of very interesting meta level concern, by the way, is that one effect that this has that's kind of a very interesting side benefit is that it makes your case difficult to prepare against.
Yeah.
Because if one of your opponents just like basically only hears you, for a very long time in the 2AR, explain like your let's say explain your second contention for a really long time, then it's like, okay, that's the contention, and here's what I understand that the contention to be. Here's a bunch of responses, and then in the next debate, like maybe they spend a lot of time on that, not so much time on contention 2, and then I would extend it and be like, without private military interference, people will use mercenaries instead. That's worse in every conceivable way, and then I'll talk about that for the entirety of the 2AR, which was a different contention. Civil Wars was one of them.
And I'll take it even a little bit step further, which is that not only does it make the arguments harder to prepare for, since you have since every argument that you've built into the 1AC is a potential 2AR strategy where you can collapse and go for just this one argument. I'd say the tone shift alone is really important, because as we talked about in the judge adaptation episode, that there are 3 levels of persuasiveness. There's the logos, the ethos, and the pathos. And if your 1AC is all logos, it's just like very straightforward logic-y stuff, maybe a little bit of ethos where you have like your credibility as a debater thrown in there. If the negative just responds with sheer logos, then all you have is the logos versus logos stuff. And so both of you have that sort of persuasion. But if you shift the tone a little bit in the 1AR to be more pathosy, for instance, well, now you have introduced a new layer of persuasion that the negative does not have. And so the negative is always a little bit behind. And then when a 2AR shifts to an even more pathosy type persuasive appeal and introduces more emotional stories and introduces a better and like a more cohesive narrative and brings together logos, ethos, and pathos into a single speech, well, now you have a form of persuasiveness that is hard to prepare against, because now you have all three types, whereas most negative debaters only go for like logos and maybe a little bit of ethos.
Yep. That's 100% true. I don't really have anything else to add on this. Did you have any last words to add here?
Yeah, just like make sure that when you're writing your affirmative, you're recognizing, hey, a good AF doesn't win the debate. If every part of this 1AC should conceivably have a function in the 2AR, it should conceivably have the ability to either win you the debate in the 2AR, or at least take out all of the negative or like an important negative argument in the 2AR, because you're writing a 1AC not for the purposes of reading a 1AC. You're writing a 1AC for the purposes of setting up a winning 2AR that can collapse properly to a few issues and sell a cohesive, hopefully emotional sounding story.
So what you're saying is I should read a definition of the United States in the AF.
Oh yeah, I know multiple judges who vote on the definition of the United States. It's amazing.
Oh, that's good. Well, it's whenever I'm like judging a debater and they're like, the United States is defined as, I'm like, good.
Yeah, I mean, this is a separate rant for a separate time, but yeah, it's also super annoying. Like, has any judge in the history of ever flowed every definition that they've read in the affirmative, especially when the affirmative reads definitions that aren't even in the topic? Like, they'll read a definition of like societal welfare, because that is their value. Like, oh gosh.
Well, that's actually kind of like a separate lesson that maybe we should talk about. One thing though, going back to less is more. If you the resolution says the United States ought to guarantee a right to housing, right? Let's say your plans are to define United States and guarantee, right? The important word there is guarantee. But if you're like, the United States is defined as, and the judge starts writing down a definition of United States, they might miss your definition of guarantee. That's like the worst case scenario. That's the important one. But instead they were focusing on the unimportant one. That's so sad. That's so sad. And going back to the definition thing that you said, I think this is a legitimate point of confusion for a lot of debaters. Like, what am I supposed to define? Aren't I supposed to define key terms? Isn't my criterion a key term? That's what they think. The real thing, though, is that the only reason that definitions are important is that, they're in the resolution. And, it's good to explain what your criterion is, but there's no reason why you need to have, like, a, definition in it, if you know what I mean. It doesn't need to be from Merriam-Webster. You can just say what you mean by your criterion, right?
Yeah.
That's
again, a rant for a different day.
Well, the day is still young, Lawrence. Actually, the podcast is wrapping up, and when we conclude from your next jazz-related interlude, we will have our end segment. Well, thank you for hanging out with us this week. This has been episode 6 of the Argument Clinic podcast. Remember to like us on the things. If you have any questions or you just want to mess with us, send us an email to theargumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com, like our Facebook page, follow our Twitter, which just only is the same thing as our Facebook page, really. So that's not super important. VBI is the best. Camp signing up period is now. I would use this opportunity to get in while some of those more tighter segments of VBI are still open. And, they have a lot of good stuff going on. Pay attention to their page, everything like that. Okay, now on to the only important segment of the podcast, the mini debate. And Lawrence, if you feign total ignorance about this topic, then I will switch it to a different topic. However, I do believe that this is pretty good. Okay, this is a shot in the dark. Lawrence, have you been to any musicals? Like plays, like musicals?
Certainly not in recent memory. Unless you count like those terrible church production musicals that happen on Sundays. For
What like church?
well, yeah, like they're like well, no, it's like
I thought you were saying that like going to church is like going to a musical.
oh no, it's like the kindergartner through fifth graders. They come out and they sing a song. They sing a
Oh,
song,
okay, okay,
act a
okay.
little play. It's like it's something that I used to do when I was younger, and now like look back on it and I'm like, wow, that was awful because they were so tiny and bad. Um, so
But you don't have like a rich understanding of musicals, or like you haven't like seen any.
certainly not to the degree as people like Herzig know and understand musicals.
Yes. The main man. Well, in that case, I won't ask you a question. Okay. Um, how about this?
My answer would have been High School Musical.
High School Musical?
That
Well,
would have been my answer no matter what the question was.
I would have crushed you, but that was okay. I was gonna go for best musical. Um,
Yeah, well, no, we're all in this together. It's a classic.
my favorite, for those of you wondering, is How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. That is a fantastic musical. Um, but anyway, now I'm thrown off. Um, okay. This one's like kind of weird. How about like this is less than maybe of okay, best animal.
Oh, okay. Um, I'm just gonna go with human. Human beings are in fact animals. We're pretty awesome.
Well, I'm gonna go with dolphins, who are like humans in that we're smart, but don't kind of go to war with one another, and
Oh,
destroy
but
the earth.
dolphins are definitely used for war. They first of all they do
That just
they
means they're employed.
they
They didn't start the war. It means someone gives them fish to do something. They just did a thing that they were just gonna do normally with basically no harm to themselves, and
they like fight each other.
they got someone else to give them fish.
As it turns out,
Yeah,
the
but they
U.S.
don't like
Navy
blow each other up or like
that's fair.
enslave each other and stuff.
Humans do suck in that respect. We actually use dolphins to like in like the Strait of Hormuz to
Oh
like
yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah.
to
I
like
know,
find
yeah.
mines. Yeah.
First of
Okay.
all, that's so sick and proves that they're cooler than humans because humans don't do that. But
No.
um,
Instead, humans have the ability to tell dolphins to do that for us.
well, it's more like dolphins do it because they can do it like easily, and then people give them free fish. It's like so sick. Like first of all, I think you picked a very weak animal with human. I think humans have a lot of problems not shared by things like dolphins. You know, they're
But we
dolphin.
also have a lot of cool things, like the ability to subject dolphins for minesweeping purposes.
Well, dolphins have the ability to sweep mines by themselves, and humans
But
don't. So taste it.
I'd much rather be the human in this instance.
Are you kidding? Being a dolphin would be great. You don't have to worry about anything. Lawrence, dolphins don't have to worry
Except for
about
being employed for minesweeping purposes.
well, very few dolphins are employed for minesweeping purposes. Most dolphins are employed doing whatever they darn well please. You know, that sounds like a pretty a pretty good job.
I get to do whatever I
Also,
darn well please, but then I also
have you
get to,
read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy?
does seeing the movie count?
Okay, I'll let that answer the question, but you
Because
know,
I don't know how to read, so.
dolphins, fair enough. Dolphins, they control everything from behind the scenes, as I'm sure you're vividly aware. So,
Oh shoot, that is a good point. Okay, I can see dolphins control the world. I think that I think that answers I think
yeah,
that answers this
that's
debate
that.
pretty well.
That's that whole part of the movie where it was like, which by the way was an entire book they condensed down to like one animated segment called "So Long and Thanks for All the Fish."
I also think that that was a new one.
Where all the dolphins like leave and like swim through space because they're like, thanks for giving us all this fish, guys, but you're screwing up the world peace.
I think this was a new argument that you introduced that you're going to collapse to for the remainder of the 2AR, and that I'm not going to have a good answer to. So I think you've
I think
demonstrated
your
why.
position is collapsing, Lawrence.
Yeah, well, my position is collapsing. You are collapsing
Ooh,
to the argument of dolphins control the world, which I don't have a good response to. It's true.
that's true. So
In fact, a
so
dolphin right now is telling me to concede this debate, so I don't know what else I'm supposed to do.
there you go. If you have if you have any inquiries for your dolphin overlord, send an email to the argumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com, and we'll be sure to forward you to the appropriate party. Well, that's the episode for this week. Thanks for staying with us for the whole episode. Listen to some of our past episodes like cross-examination, the topic analysis, etc. And above all, stay frosty.
No, this isn't an argument.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't. It's just contradiction.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
It is not.